Airports have a rhythm of their own, an endless humming orchestra of movement and voices, punctuated by the rolling thunder of departing planes. She moved through the terminal that morning with the same steady pace she'd carried through dozens of flights before. Her ticket was neatly folded inside her passport. Her carry-on held a laptop, a book she probably wouldn't read, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones that promised to make the journey quieter than it really was. She wasn't a nervous flyer. In fact, she'd long since grown accustomed to the routine, the shuffle through security, the long march past duty-free shops, and the predictable moment when the gate agent called her boarding group. Today felt no different. She yawned as she waited in line, adjusted the strap of her bag, and offered a polite smile to the stranger ahead of her who complained about delays. When her turn came, she scanned her ticket, stepped onto the jet bridge, and entered the familiar narrow tunnel that always smelled faintly of metal and recycled air. The transition from airport chaos to airplane stillness was always striking. She found her seat, 18B, a middle seat between the window and the aisle. Not ideal, but tolerable. She tucked her bag beneath the seat, fastened her belt, and took out her phone for one last glance at the messages she hadn't answered. The cabin filled around her, a mixture of tired travelers, business people hunched over phones, and families juggling restless children. The chatter was ordinary, comforting in its normalcy. A child asked her mother if clouds were soft to sit on. A man in a business suit sighed heavily as he typed furiously on a laptop before takeoff. The overhead bins slammed shut one by one until the crew began their pre-flight checks. She settled back, letting the hum of activity wash over her. It was a familiar ritual. Buckle, breathe, wait for the engines to roar. Her mind wandered to her destination, the meetings she had, the friends she might see afterward, the promise of sleeping in her own bed. She wasn't thinking of danger or drama. To her, this was just another flight, and she had no reason to believe otherwise. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and practiced. He welcomed everyone aboard, gave the estimated flight time, and assured passengers of smooth skies ahead. His tone was warm, the kind that made nervous flyers unclench their fists and made seasoned travelers like her simply nod and return to their phones. The engines whined to life, vibrating beneath her feet as the plane pushed back from the gate. She felt the familiar tilt as it taxied toward the runway. Outside, the world blurred. Planes queued, service vehicles darted like ants, and the runway stretched out like a promise. Then came the takeoff, that exhilarating moment when physics lifted tons of steel into the sky. She felt her body pressed into the seat as the engines roared louder, the ground fell away, and the cabin tilted upward into a climb. Within minutes, the city below became a patchwork of streets and rivers, shrinking until it looked like a child's map. At 30,000 feet, the plane leveled out. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and a gentle wave of relief spread across the cabin. People reached for laptops, magazines, and drinks. The flight attendants rolled carts down the aisle, their smiles rehearsed but genuine enough. She accepted a cup of water and smiled back, thanking the attendant before turning to gaze out the window beyond her seatmate. The clouds outside were soft and endless, glowing white against the sharp blue sky. She often thought of how peaceful the world looked from up here, as if every problem remained trapped far below the clouds. Up here, there was nothing but calm. She sipped her water, opened her book, and tried to read, but the words blurred. Instead, her mind drifted. She thought about her life, the busyness of work, the calls she hadn't returned, the family she hadn't visited in months. Flying always gave her that strange in-between time where she could neither rush ahead nor retreat behind. It was time suspended, where all she could do was think. Around her, life unfolded in the ordinary ways of a flight. The businessman typed furiously beside her, his elbows edging into her space. A child giggled 2 rows back, delighting in the plastic wings a flight attendant had just pinned to her shirt. A young couple whispered over a shared set of headphones, laughing softly at something only they could hear. It was normal, almost boring, and that was comforting. She leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, and felt the steady vibration of the engines beneath her seat. This was the rhythm of travel, predictable, safe, routine. She had no idea that, even as she sipped her water and traced patterns in the clouds, controllers on the ground were already watching her flight with unease. Signals were being missed. Messages sent to the cockpit weren't answered. On radar screens miles below, blinking icons carried a different weight, a silent alarm that protocol demanded be answered. But she knew none of this. To her, it was still just another flight. She opened her book again and tried to focus, underlining a line that caught her attention. She shifted in her seat, adjusted the overhead vent, and wondered when the attendants would serve snacks. The quiet hum of the engines lulled her into a calm so complete that she could never have guessed how fragile it was. Somewhere outside her little oval window, events were already in motion. Calls were being made, decisions weighed, and jets were being fueled, prepared to take off in defense of the skies. But inside the cabin, she was only a passenger, just one of many, wrapped in the illusion that nothing extraordinary could possibly happen on such an ordinary day. The hum of the engines had settled into its steady rhythm, a kind of background noise that made some passengers doze and others sink deeper into their books or laptops. For a while, everything remained ordinary. The attendants moved down the aisles with their carts, offering drinks and snacks. Polite exchanges filled the space, the occasional clink of ice in plastic cups breaking the monotony. But as the flight pushed deeper into its journey, she began to notice something was off. At first, it was nothing more than an intuition, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The attendants' smiles, so easy during boarding, now looked strained. Their conversations with one another weren't the usual light chatter about connections or hotel stays. They were hushed, urgent, whispered just out of earshot of the passengers. From her seat, she saw 2 attendants pause near the cockpit door. One leaned in, pressing her hand against the wall for balance as she whispered. The other nodded, lips pursed, eyes darting nervously toward the closed cockpit. The exchange lasted seconds, but it was long enough to spark unease in her chest. Passengers are perceptive, even when they pretend not to be. Across the cabin, others noticed too. A mother hushed her child, her gaze flicking toward the crew. A businessman stopped typing, ears straining to catch the muted tones of the attendants. Even the couple who had been laughing quietly earlier grew silent, their smiles fading as they studied the expressions around them. The silence deepened. It wasn't absolute. The engines still throned, people still shifted in their seats, but it carried a new weight. It was the silence of anticipation, of waiting for an explanation that never came. She felt it settle around her like an invisible fog. Her heartbeat quickened, though she forced herself to breathe evenly. Logic told her it could be anything. Turbulence ahead, a medical issue, or some routine procedure she didn't understand. But instincts whispered otherwise. The flight attendants made another pass through the cabin, but their steps were quicker, their movements sharper. When she asked for another cup of water, the attendant smiled too brightly, said, "Of course," too quickly, and returned with a shaky hand that sloshed water over the rim. That was when fear began to spread, quietly, almost invisibly, but undeniably present. Her seatmate, the businessman, leaned slightly toward her. "Do you notice something?" he murmured, keeping his voice low. She nodded, unsure what to say. "They're nervous," he continued, eyes locked on the attendants. "And when they're nervous—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Minutes stretched, each one slower than the last. The intercom remained silent. Usually by this point, there would have been some casual update, the altitude, the weather ahead, the reassuring tone of the captain's voice. Instead, there was nothing but the mechanical drone of the engines. The absence of sound became its own message. A man in the aisle seat, across from her, pressed the call button. When the attendant appeared, he asked bluntly, "Is everything all right?" The attendant's practiced smile appeared again, but her eyes betrayed her. "Yes, sir, everything's fine." "Please remain seated." She moved on too quickly, not waiting for further questions. Fine. Everything was fine. But it wasn't. Everyone could feel it. She folded her hands in her lap, gripping them tightly to hide the tremor in her fingers. She tried to distract herself with her book, but the words blurred. Her mind conjured possibilities, each darker than the last. Mechanical issues. A medical emergency. Or worse, the kind of scenario no passenger wanted to imagine. The silence pressed heavier with every mile. From the window, the world outside remained serene. Clouds drifted lazily below, the sky an endless canvas of blue. It was almost insulting, the way nature looked so calm, while inside the cabin tension tightened like a rope. The businessman beside her sighed and closed his laptop, muttering something about not being able to focus. The mother across the aisle clutched her child closer, rocking her gently, though the little girl was fast asleep. Small movements like these carried the weight of shared anxiety. No one spoke it aloud, but everyone understood. Then came the moment that confirmed her fears. She watched as one of the attendants knocked on the cockpit door, leaning close to whisper to whoever opened it. The door cracked for only a second, but she caught a glimpse of the captain's face, pale, drawn, lips pressed into a tight line. The door closed again, locking with its usual metallic click. Her stomach twisted. The captain hadn't looked like a man in control of a routine flight. He'd looked like someone calculating, debating, worried. She leaned back into her seat, her pulse loud in her ears. The cabin around her seemed smaller suddenly, the air thicker. The conversations that did exist were whispers, fragments of fear carried through the rows. One man muttered, "I've flown 100 times. I've never seen a crew look like that." Another whispered, "Maybe it's nothing. Maybe the radios are out." The word radios struck her, though she didn't fully understand why. What she didn't know, what none of the passengers knew, was that below them, hundreds of miles away, air traffic controllers were frantically trying to reach their flight. Calls were going unanswered. Signals weren't returning. On their screens, the aircraft was a silent blip moving steadily across the radar. But silence itself was the danger. For the passengers, ignorance was both a shield and a prison. They felt the tension without understanding the stakes. To them, it was simply an uneasy silence, one that gnawed at the edges of their thoughts and refused to let go. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the moment this would all be explained. She pictured the captain's voice breaking the silence, assuring everyone it had been nothing, a minor glitch, a problem already resolved. She wanted that voice so badly, she almost prayed for it. But the intercom remained dead. The minutes dragged on, stretching into what felt like hours. Every flicker of movement drew eyes. Every murmur sparked suspicion. And though the plane flew smoothly, cutting across the sky as if nothing were wrong, the cabin's atmosphere told a different story. She gripped the armrest, knuckles white. The silence wasn't just uneasy anymore. It was terrifying. And far below, 2 F-16s were already racing toward the sky, called to intercept the silent aircraft she was aboard. But she didn't know that yet. For her, all she had was the silence, and the growing certainty that something had gone very, very wrong. Far below the cruising aircraft, In the windowless halls of an air traffic control center, unease had grown into alarm. Controllers sat in front of glowing radar screens, headsets pressed to their ears, voices sharp with concentration. They had tried the usual channels again and again, calling out to the flight by name, requesting acknowledgement. Nothing. Not a word. At first, they had assumed it was a simple glitch. Radios failed sometimes. Frequencies needed to be switched. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence hardened into something more dangerous. A passenger jet flying at altitude, cutting across controlled airspace, ignoring repeated calls. It was the kind of scenario no one ever wanted to see. "Try them again," the supervisor ordered, leaning over a controller's shoulder. "Flight 322. This is control. Do you read?" Nothing. Only static. The supervisor's face tightened. In this line of work, silence was never innocent. Protocols existed for moments exactly like this. Protocols written in response to tragedies no one wanted to repeat. When a commercial airliner stopped responding, the possibility could not be ignored. Hijacking, incapacitated crew, even a plane turned into a weapon. The controllers exchanged grim looks. The choice was clear. "Scramble alert," the supervisor said at last. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. "Get the Air Force." On a military base hundreds of miles away, alarms rang. Pilots sprinted toward their aircraft, the sleek F-16s gleaming beneath the sun. Ground crews moved in a blur, tugging hoses, locking panels, signaling thumbs up. The jets, always on standby for threats that might never come, were about to earn their purpose. Two pilots climbed into their cockpits, strapping in with muscle memory drilled over years of training. There was no time for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. In situations like this, every second mattered. Falcon 1 ready. Falcon 2 ready. The engines screamed to life, the roar reverberating across the tarmac. Tower clearance came almost immediately. There was no room for delay. The F-16s thundered down the runway, nose wheels lifting, wings slicing upward into the open sky. Within moments, they were airborne, banking sharply toward the coordinates of the silent jet. In the passenger cabin above the clouds, she still sat in her seat, unaware of the storm brewing beneath her. The uneasy silence continued, heavy and unnatural, but no one knew what was happening outside. She glanced around, noticing other passengers shifting, whispering, fidgeting in their seats. A man pulled out his phone, only to remember there was no signal this high up. A woman clutched her rosary beads, lips moving in prayer. But to them, the danger was vague, an invisible shadow. To the pilots racing toward them, it was a very real, very specific threat. Target acquired. Falcon 1 reported as their radar locked on to the commercial jet. A green icon glowed on his screen, a silent blip cruising at steady speed and altitude. To the naked eye, the jet was just a speck on the horizon, but it was a speck carrying hundreds of lives and possibly danger. The F-16s closed in, climbing higher, cutting through thin clouds. The pilots stayed calm, voices clipped and professional, but their nerves sharpened. They knew the history. They remembered the lessons carved into memory by past attacks. If this plane had been taken, if it was heading for a city, the responsibility to stop it might fall to them. Falcon 2's voice crackled over the radio. "Approach vector set. I've got visual." Through his canopy, he saw the passenger jet gliding ahead, serene and oblivious. A strange contradiction, he thought, something so peaceful in appearance, and yet possibly so dangerous. Back in the control center, the supervisor leaned close to the microphone. "Falcon flight, you are cleared to intercept. Attempt visual contact. Confirm situation." "Acknowledged," Falcon 1 replied. The fighters pushed harder, afterburners igniting, flames streaking from their tails as they surged closer. The commercial jet grew larger in their view, its silver fuselage gleaming. Inside the passenger cabin, she finally noticed something outside her window. At first, it looked like a shimmer of light, maybe sunlight reflecting off the clouds. But as it drew closer, she realized it wasn't light at all. It was metal. Her eyes widened. The sleek nose of a fighter jet appeared just beyond the wing, closing the distance with alarming speed. Gasps erupted in the cabin as others saw it too. Fingers pointed. Voices rose. "Is that? That's a military plane." She pressed her face to the window, watching the fighter jet glide parallel to them, close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet, the visor glinting. The jet waggled its wings deliberately, a signal. A businessman beside her whispered, "Oh my God." In the cockpit of the commercial jet, the captain and first officer worked frantically. The radios were dead, no matter what frequencies they tried. Dials were twisted, switches flipped, emergency backups tested. Nothing. When the F-16 appeared outside, the captain's stomach dropped. He knew exactly what it meant. They weren't just unresponsive. They were suspected. "We need to show them we're under control," he muttered to the first officer, gesturing toward the steady altitude and course. "Hold it steady. Don't give them a reason to doubt." But he also knew the terrifying truth. Without communication, the F-16 pilots had no way of knowing whether they were harmless or hostile. Falcon 1 to control. Target remains unresponsive. No deviation in course or altitude. No visual signs of distress. The controller's voice came back, tense. "Maintain shadow. Await further orders. Additional support en route." Falcon 1 adjusted his position, keeping tight formation with the passenger jet. Falcon 2 mirrored on the opposite side, boxing the larger plane between them. From inside, passengers stared out both sides of the cabin, fear written across their faces. Some clutched hands, others muttered prayers. She felt her pulse hammering in her chest. The fighter outside was both terrifying and oddly comforting, a symbol of protection, but also a reminder of how dire the situation must be. On the ground, commanders reviewed the data streaming in. The passenger jet had deviated slightly from its filed route, though it could have been for weather. The lack of communication remained the glaring problem. The possibility of hijacking loomed. "Keep the intercept," one officer said grimly. "We may need escalation if they head toward a populated area." The word escalation hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew what it meant. Above the clouds, the F-16s and the silent jet flew together, a strange and uneasy formation. For the pilots, the decision sharpened. If this plane was a threat, they might be asked to do the unthinkable. For the passengers, ignorance shielded them. They saw the fighters, but not the orders that hovered unspoken over their flight. She gripped her seat, staring at the fighter's steady presence outside her window. The ordinary journey she'd begun hours ago had transformed into something unrecognizable. She didn't know why the jet was there. She didn't know what it meant. But far below, the truth was already clear. A call for help had been made, and the fighters had answered. She had flown many times before, and she had grown used to the monotonous view outside airplane windows, clouds, sky, maybe the faint outline of land far below. But nothing in her life had prepared her for this. It started as a shimmer, a flash of light against the endless blue. At first, she thought it was sunlight catching on the wing, or perhaps another airliner far off in the distance. But then the shimmer sharpened into form, angular, metallic, purposeful. A fighter jet. Her breath caught in her throat. The F-16 slid into view just beyond their left wing, close enough that she could see the gleam of its canopy, the hard edges of its design, the unmistakable silhouette that she had only ever seen in movies. Its presence was powerful, almost predatory, yet graceful as it matched their speed effortlessly. A wave of gasps rolled through the cabin as other passengers noticed. Fingers pointed. A child exclaimed, "Look, a jet." Before his mother hushed him quickly, her face pale. The businessman beside her muttered under his breath, "This isn't good. This isn't good at all." The fighter moved with deliberate precision, first lowering slightly, then waggling its wings. To her, it looked like a wave. But deep down, she knew it wasn't meant as a greeting. It was a signal. She pressed her face against the cold window, heart hammering. Through the tinted canopy of the fighter, she caught a glimpse of the pilot's helmet, a dark visor that revealed nothing of the person inside. Still, the knowledge that someone was watching them, evaluating them, judging the danger they might pose, it sent chills down her spine. Around her, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from uneasy silence to palpable fear. Passengers spoke in low, urgent voices. Some prayed quietly, clutching rosaries or folding their hands tight. Others stared wide-eyed, frozen, unable to look away from the jet outside. The crew moved quickly down the aisles, but their attempts at reassurance rang hollow. One attendant knelt beside an elderly passenger, speaking softly, though her hands trembled as she adjusted the woman's seatbelt. Another passed by, offering a too bright smile, and the same repeated phrase, "Everything is fine." But no one believed it anymore. The businessman leaned toward her. "Do you know what that means?" He whispered. She shook her head, though a cold knot had already formed in her stomach. "It means we're not talking to anyone on the ground," he said. "They think we're a threat." Her eyes widened. A threat? The very idea felt absurd. They were just passengers, ordinary people on an ordinary flight. But as she stared at the F-16 holding formation outside, she realized how little it mattered what she knew. To the jets, to the people making decisions far away, the only thing that mattered was silence. Silence looked like danger. Silence could look like intent. Another ripple of commotion swept through the cabin as a second fighter appeared on the opposite side. Now the passenger jet was boxed in, shadowed by sleek, deadly guardians. From both windows, passengers could see their escorts, the military presence undeniable. Fear escalated. A woman a few rows ahead began to sob quietly, her hands over her face. Someone else demanded answers from a passing attendant. What's happening? Why are they here? The attendant hesitated, lips parting as if to explain, and only said, "Please remain calm. We'll be landing soon. Landing soon." The words struck her like an icy gust. Landing where? Under what circumstances? She turned back to the window, unable to look away from the fighter jet beside them. Its pilot lifted a gloved hand, making a slow gesture toward the cockpit of their plane. Was it a command? A warning? She couldn't tell. Her pulse raced. Every sound inside the cabin seemed sharper now. The rustle of clothing as people shifted in their seats. The sharp click of a seatbelt being refastened. The faint sob of a child muffled against his mother's shoulder. The ordinary noises of flight had transformed into an orchestra of fear. She tried to imagine what the pilots in the cockpit were feeling. Were they panicking? Calmly trying to fix a broken radio? Did they know, as she now suspected, that their silence was being interpreted as danger? The thought of it made her throat tighten. The businessman leaned back in his seat with a sigh, rubbing his face with both hands. If they think we're hostile. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing her thoughts to slow. But when she opened them again, the fighter jet was still there, unwavering, unblinking, a reminder that their lives were no longer just their own. They were in the hands of strangers flying alongside them, strangers with weapons capable of ending everything in an instant. The surrealness of it all struck her suddenly. This morning, she had stood in line for coffee, scrolled absently through her phone, thought only of making it to her destination. Now she was in the center of a silent standoff in the sky, part of a story no one could have predicted. She glanced around at her fellow passengers. Some avoided the windows entirely, unwilling to see the truth outside. Others stared openly, expressions a mixture of awe and terror. A young man 2 rows ahead lifted his phone, as if to record the scene, before remembering there was no signal, no way to share it with the world. They were alone, suspended above the earth, sealed inside this pressurized capsule of fear. The plane itself remained steady, engines humming without fault. If not for the jets outside, it might have seemed like a perfectly normal flight. But she knew better now. Normalcy had been shattered the moment that first fighter appeared. Her chest tightened. She thought of her family, of the text messages she hadn't sent before takeoff. She imagined her loved ones going about their days, unaware that she was thousands of feet above the ground, staring at a military jet that might, in some unthinkable scenario, be ordered to fire. The possibility made her throat burn with unspoken words. If this was the last chapter of her life, she would leave it unfinished. The fighter waggled its wings again, banking slightly to adjust its position. She followed its every movement, eyes locked. In that moment, she wished she could somehow speak to the pilot, to tell him she was just a passenger, just an ordinary woman who wanted nothing more than to land safely. But no voice could bridge the silence. Instead, all she could do was sit there, strapped into her seat, watching the surreal dance of jets outside her window. The weight of the unknown pressed down on her, as heavy as gravity itself. And though she didn't know it yet, the worst of the silence still lay ahead. From inside the cockpit of an F-16, the world looked sharper, faster, more unforgiving than it ever could from the windows of a passenger jet. Every control, every gauge, every vibration is magnified into meaning. The pilots knew this feeling intimately. The hum of engines tuned for war, the weight of responsibility riding not just on their shoulders, but on every decision made in split seconds. Falcon 1, visual confirmed. The lead pilot's voice crackled across the comms. Civilian jet maintaining altitude. No communication received. Holding course. His tone was professional, but beneath it lay tension, a current too heavy to ignore. Falcon 2's voice followed, calm but clipped. Copy. Formation locked. No visible signs of distress. The 2 fighters bracketed the passenger plane, each keeping a careful, calculated distance. From their vantage, the large jet seemed serene, its engines steady, its wings level. But serenity was not reassurance. Silence was the enemy. Silence could mean anything. Inside his helmet, Falcon 1's breathing was steady but measured. He had trained for this scenario countless times in simulations. Scramble, intercept, assess. He knew the checklist by heart. Yet no amount of training could make the reality easier. He was flying alongside a plane carrying hundreds of souls, and his orders could, in the darkest possibility, end them. He swallowed, eyes scanning the jet's fuselage. Passengers peered from windows, tiny faces pressed to glass. He saw fear in them, though they couldn't see his. The visor shielded him, turned him into an anonymous figure of authority, of threat. He wondered if they knew how much he didn't want to be here in this role. Falcon 2's voice broke the silence. Think it's comes failure? Could be, Falcon 1 replied. Could also be hijack. Protocol says we assume worst until proven otherwise. That was the burden. Assume danger, even when danger wasn't visible. Because the one time you assumed otherwise could be the time disaster struck. He thought about the history drilled into every pilot of his generation. He thought of the morning when civilian planes had once been turned into weapons, when hesitation had cost thousands of lives. The memory of that day lived in every briefing, every exercise. They had sworn it would never happen again. And now, here he was, potentially standing between safety and tragedy. Falcon flight, maintain intercept, the controller's voice ordered through their radios. Ground command is monitoring. Await further instruction. Further instruction. He knew what that meant. Somewhere, commanders were debating, weighing lives against risk. Somewhere, a decision could be forming that he might have to execute. His gloved hand flexed on the control stick. Training told him to stay detached, to think only in terms of mission objectives. But he couldn't help the thoughts pressing in. Families inside that jet, children clutching their parents, ordinary people sipping water and reading books, unaware that their fates might rest on the trigger beneath his thumb. Falcon 2 spoke again, his voice quieter, more personal. You ever think about what it'd be like if they gave the order? Falcon 1 didn't answer right away. He had thought about it. Every pilot had. In the quiet moments before sleep, during long hours of patrol, the question lingered. Could he do it? Could he follow through if the command came? The textbooks and training said yes. The oath said yes. But his heart hesitated. Finally, he replied, You don't think about it. You just do what you're ordered. But both of them knew it wasn't that simple. The passenger jet remained steady, cruising as though nothing were wrong. Its nose pointed toward its flight path, engines humming, oblivious to the tension building around it. The irony wasn't lost on him. Inside, life probably felt normal enough, save for the sight of the fighters outside. Coffee cups, crying babies, the shuffle of magazines, none of them knowing how close the scales were to tipping. Falcon 1 flicked a switch, activating his lights in a coded signal. The commercial jet made no reply. No tilt of wings, no radio response, nothing. Just silence. Still nothing, he muttered. Damn it, he imagined scenarios. What if hijackers were in the cockpit, holding a gun to the captain's head, forcing him to fly silent? What if the crew had been incapacitated by some unknown means? What if this massive jet, full of innocent people, was now a weapon waiting to strike a city below? The possibilities ate at him. Falcon flight, maintain visual. A-10 inbound for support, the controller reported. An A-10. That meant they weren't just monitoring. They were preparing for the long game. The Warthog wasn't built for speed. It was built to linger, to endure. Its presence meant they expected this might drag on, that decisions might come slowly, or that escalation might require more than speed alone. Falcon 1 exhaled sharply, though it fogged his visor for only a moment. He tightened his grip on the stick. His eyes flicked down to the panel, then back up to the massive plane lumbering ahead. He thought of his family. His wife, who had kissed him goodbye that morning with a reminder to pick up groceries on his way home. His little boy, who had waved from the porch, pretending to fly with his arms stretched wide. Would they understand if today ended differently? Would they forgive him if he had to explain that duty had demanded the unthinkable? Falcon 2's voice cut through his thoughts. They look steady. No aggressive maneuvers. Could just be comes. Could be, Falcon 1 admitted. But could be isn't good enough. The weight of those words pressed on both of them. He glanced again at the windows of the passenger jet. More faces now. People were watching, pointing. Fear was written across their expressions. Did they see him as protector or as executioner? Maybe both. A lump formed in his throat. He couldn't let it show. Falcon flight, be advised, the controller's voice returned. Command is monitoring potential intercept termination if contact is re-established. Until then, rules of engagement remain unchanged. Rules of engagement. Those sterile words hid the darkest truth. If the plane turned toward a city, if it deviated suddenly, if it showed any sign of intent, they might be ordered to bring it down. He prayed silently that it would never come to that. For now, all they could do was hold position, circling protectively, like wolves keeping watch over a herd. The A-10 was on its way. Time was buying itself, and the silent plane flew on, oblivious to how much rested in its steady hum. Inside the cabin of that jet, he imagined the fear growing. He could almost see the passengers staring back, their faces pale against the windows. He wished he could tell them what he knew, that he didn't want to hurt them, that his finger on the trigger was a burden heavier than they could ever imagine. But no words could cross that distance. So he stayed in formation, visor reflecting the sun, the silent guardian and silent threat all at once. And in his chest, a battle raged between duty and humanity, between the oath he had sworn and the life he had lived. The dilemma wasn't just his alone. It belonged to every pilot who had ever taken to the skies with the weight of such responsibility. It belonged to the history that had shaped their training, the fear that had shaped their orders, the silence that now stretched between one plane and another. And as the passenger jet flew on, mute and steady, Falcon 1 whispered a prayer only he could hear. Please, let them just be lost in the silence. The F-16s had been dancing alongside the passenger jet for long enough that every second felt like an hour. Their presence was sharp, tense, urgent, a scalpel poised above the artery of uncertainty. But when the A-10 arrived, it was like the steady thrum of a drumbeat, slow but unyielding, deliberate in a way the others were not. From the window of the passenger jet, she noticed it before anyone else on her side. At first, it seemed ungainly, its shape strange compared to the sleek, knife-like fighters flanking them. The A-10 didn't look like it belonged in the same sky. Its wide wings stretched out, its engines mounted like twin eyes above its body, its nose heavy with the unmistakable bulk of the cannon for which it was famous. It didn't move with the quick grace of the F-16s. It moved like something older, sturdier, a presence that suggested patience and endurance. Whispers spread through the cabin as others saw it. Another one. What kind is that? Why are there three now? The sight of a third military plane escalated the fear again. But for her, there was something strangely different about this one. Its deliberate pace seemed to signal not escalation, but persistence, as though this was no longer just a frantic intercept, but a vigil. Inside the cockpit of the A-10, the pilot adjusted his throttle, matching the speed of the commercial jet. Unlike the F-16s, he hadn't been scrambling from a nearby base at supersonic speeds. His bird wasn't built for speed. It was built to linger, to stay where it was needed long after others had burned through their fuel. Warthog 1 in formation, he reported calmly over comms. His voice was steady, unhurried, the tone of someone used to operating in drawn-out engagements. Visual on target. Holding pattern established. Falcon 1 acknowledged, relief edging his clipped reply. Copy, Warthog. Glad to have you. The A-10 pilot knew what his presence meant. He wasn't there to deliver speed or shock. He was there to provide endurance, to keep eyes on the situation, long enough for cooler heads to prevail. His aircraft was a symbol as much as a machine, a reminder that the intercept didn't have to end in fire. He studied the passenger plane through his canopy. Like the Falcons, he could see faces in the windows, pale ovals framed by glass. He wondered if they understood what his aircraft represented. He hoped they saw something steady, not threatening. The A-10's design, blunt and almost awkward, carried none of the Predator's menace of the F-16s. But its cannon, the GAU-8 Avenger, dominated its nose like a warning. He knew the passengers must have seen it. What did they think? That he was here to blast them from the sky? The thought twisted his stomach. He reminded himself of his mission. Stay close, monitor, support. He wasn't here to frighten them. He was here to keep the situation from spiraling into rash decisions. The Warthog wasn't about first strikes. It was about persistence. Inside the passenger cabin, the reaction to the A-10's arrival was complicated. Fear sharpened at first, but then softened into something else. Curiosity, maybe even a flicker of hope. The businesslike passengers who had muttered darkly at the F-16s now whispered, "That one looks slower. Maybe it's here to help." She pressed her forehead to the window, studying its wide wings, its purposeful crawl through the sky. Something about it felt less hostile, more like a guardian taking its post. For the first time since the intercept began, her panic eased slightly. She wasn't sure why. Back in the A-10 cockpit, the pilot coordinated with command. Target jet is maintaining altitude and heading. Suggest prolonged shadow until comms restored. Fuel levels nominal for extended watch. That was the advantage he brought, time. Where the Falcons would soon need to peel away to refuel, he could remain. His engines weren't designed for speed records. They were designed for reliability. His plane could loiter for hours, circling endlessly, watching without blinking. Falcon 2's voice came over the comms, taut with fatigue. "Good to have you here, Warthog. Feels less like we're carrying this alone." The A-10 pilot understood. He could hear the strain in their voices. F-16 pilots lived with adrenaline like a constant drumbeat, their missions short and sharp. But endurance was his domain. His job was to arrive, steady the rhythm, and remind them that time could sometimes solve what bullets never should. On the ground, controllers adjusted their tone too. With the A-10 on station, their reports became calmer, more measured. They now had more options, more room to breathe. Time had entered the equation, yet the threat still loomed. The passenger jet remained silent, its cockpit dark to their eyes, its radios mute. For all they knew, danger still lurked behind that stillness. Every second could still tip into catastrophe. The A-10 pilot felt the weight of it too. He wasn't immune to the dilemma pressing on the Falcons. If the order came, he might also be called upon to act. And though his aircraft wasn't as sleek as theirs, it carried enough firepower to tear apart the silence in an instant. He looked again at the faces in the windows. He saw fear, yes, but also humanity, lives tied together in that fragile aluminum tube. And he thought of his own family, waiting for him at home. His daughter's drawings still taped to his locker back at base, stick figures holding hands under a sun with a smiley face. Would he go home to her with blood on his hands, even if that blood was spilled under orders? The thought weighed heavy, but he forced himself back to the mission. His presence wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The longer he stayed, the longer decision-makers on the ground had to deliberate, to gather facts, to avoid a choice no one wanted to make. Inside the passenger jet, the shift was subtle but real. Fear still pressed heavily in the air, but alongside it came the faintest sense of patience. The sight of 3 planes holding them steady in the sky was terrifying. Yes, but also oddly stabilizing. It felt less like the countdown of a fuse and more like the prolonged hum of suspense. She sensed it too. For the first time, she leaned back slightly in her seat, her white-knuckled grip on the armrest loosening just a little. She didn't feel safe, not yet. But she felt that maybe, just maybe, someone was watching out for them, not just watching them. The A-10 circled into its steady rhythm, its engines droning like a mantra of persistence. For the passengers, for the F-16s, for command below, it was a reminder that the sky was vast enough for patience. And in that patience lay their only hope. The minutes dragged on like hours. Every second that the passenger jet remained silent stretched the nerves of everyone in the sky and on the ground. The F-16s continued their vigil, darting slightly to adjust positions, their sleek wings glinting in the sun. The A-10 lumbered beside them, steady and immovable, like a watchman who had no intention of leaving. But silence still ruled. Inside the cabin, fear had hardened into resignation. Passengers spoke less now, as though words themselves were dangerous. The crew moved carefully, avoiding eye contact, their forced calm cracking under the strain. And she sat rigid in her seat, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the strange triangle of aircraft that boxed them in. It had become a surreal kind of waiting room, suspended thousands of feet above the earth, with fate sealed in the quiet between radio calls. In the F-16 cockpit, Falcon 1's jaw ached from clenching. His eyes burned from scanning the passenger plane for any sign, any clue. He had begun to imagine the worst-case scenarios so vividly that they played like a movie in his mind. A cockpit overrun by hijackers, a sudden dive toward a city skyline, the unthinkable order shouted through his headset. But then, in the middle of the suffocating silence, something changed. A crackle. So faint at first, he thought it was static, just the usual hiss of radio waves. But then words formed, broken, distorted, but unmistakably human. This is Flight 482. We repeat. Flight 482. Falcon 1's eyes widened. He snapped his head toward his comms panel. Say again, Flight 482. Say again. The voice came clearer this time, thin but real. Flight 482. Experiencing radio malfunction. Requesting confirmation. Repeat, this is Flight 482. We are unable to transmit consistently. Falcon 1 exhaled so hard it fogged his visor. Relief surged through him, flooding out the tension that had gripped his chest. He almost laughed, but discipline kept his voice level. Flight 482. This is Falcon 1. We have you visual. You've been out of contact. Do you copy? The reply was ragged, but coherent. Copy, Falcon 1. We've been attempting to restore comms. Apologies for loss of contact. All passengers safe. Repeat, all passengers safe. The words rippled outward like shockwaves. In the other F-16, Falcon 2's voice cracked with relief. Command, you hear that? They're clean. They're just clean. On the A-10 channel, Warthog 1's steady baritone carried a note of gratitude. Thank God. On the ground, the command center erupted in voices, controllers relaying the message, commanders confirming, analysts updating threat levels in real time. Monitors that had been glowing red with warnings flipped to amber then began trending toward green. The weight of imminent disaster began to lift. Inside the passenger cabin, the breakthrough arrived more subtly. The captain's voice, strained but audible through the intercom, spoke at last. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've experienced a temporary communication failure with air traffic control. We have now re-established partial contact. Everything is under control. Please remain seated as we continue our coordination with escort aircraft. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, sobs of relief, the sound of nervous laughter. Passengers who had been bracing for the end now clutched one another, whispering prayers of gratitude. She felt her own tears spring hot to her eyes. Her body trembled as the knot in her stomach began to untangle. She pressed her palms together against her lips, whispering, "Thank you, thank you," though she wasn't sure to whom, to the pilots, to the escorts, to fate itself. For the F-16 pilots, the dilemma that had nearly consumed them began to fade into the rearview of adrenaline. Falcon 1 adjusted his headset, his voice firmer now. Flight 482. Confirm you are under no duress? The reply came steady. Negative, Falcon 1. We are not under duress. Repeat, no duress. This is a systems failure. We apologize for the alarm. The words washed over him like water on parched earth. He nodded to himself, though no one could see it. The worst had not come. The choice he had feared, the one he had prayed against, would not be demanded of him today. Falcon 2 broke the formality with a chuckle. Weary, but genuine. I'll take a busted radio over the alternative any day. Even Warhog 1 allowed a small smile beneath his oxygen mask. His slow, steady aircraft had bought them time, and time had given space for the truth to emerge. As coordination flowed between command and the now communicating passenger jet, orders shifted. The fighters would continue escort until the civilian flight was safely rerouted to a nearby base for inspection. The crisis was ending, but not over until wheels touched ground. Still, relief was contagious. Inside the cabin, passengers began talking again, voices rising with nervous energy. Some even laughed shakily, the kind of laughter that bursts out when fear finally cracks. The businessman beside her muttered, "A damn radio." All this over a damn radio, shaking his head with disbelief. She smiled faintly through her tears, though the memory of the F-16s outside her window would never leave her. The image of their silent, watchful eyes had been seared into her mind forever. The captain spoke again, his voice steadier now. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be escorted for the remainder of our flight as a precaution. Please remain calm and trust that all is well." For once, the word sounded true. In the F-16, Falcon 1 allowed himself to glance once more at the faces in the windows of the passenger jet. They were smiling now, or crying tears of relief, or clapping each other on the shoulders. For the first time that day, he felt seen not as a threat, but as a savior. His chest loosened. He keyed his mic softly, almost as a confession to himself. "We're all going home tonight." And as the three escorts flanked the passenger jet in a protective arc, the skies themselves seemed to sigh in relief. The moment the wheels of Flight 482 touched the runway, the cabin erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, scattered clapping that sometimes followed a smooth landing. This was desperate, grateful, unrestrained. Hands slapped together like prayers made visible, a chorus of relief echoing through the fuselage. She joined them, her palms stinging as she clapped until her arms trembled. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't care. The roar of the engine slowing, the jolt of rubber gripping earth, these were the sounds of deliverance. The plane taxied slowly, flanked still by its military guardians. Out the window, she could see the A-10 shadowing them like a steadfast shepherd, while the F-16s swept wider arcs, their presence both protective and commanding. For hours, those aircraft had been symbols of dread and danger. Now, as the ground drew closer, they seemed almost angelic, winged sentinels who had refused to abandon them to uncertainty. When the aircraft finally rolled to a halt at a remote section of the airfield, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. This time, it carried warmth, steadiness, even a hint of emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely. Emergency crews will be conducting routine checks before we disembark. On behalf of the crew, thank you for your patience and courage today." The words cracked something inside her. Courage? She didn't feel courageous. She felt like a woman who had stared at death through a tiny oval window and prayed it would pass her by. But maybe that was courage in its rawest form, not the absence of fear, but the endurance of it. The cabin doors opened and the rush of fresh air spilled in. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles waited nearby, their lights flashing silently, a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Passengers shuffled off the plane, some clutching their carry-ons like lifelines, others leaving them behind without care. No one wanted to linger in that fuselage any longer than necessary. As she stepped onto the mobile stairway, her knees wobbled beneath her. The tarmac stretched wide and endless, the sky vast above, but her eyes were drawn to the military jets. The F-16s were already peeling away, banking upward to return to base. The A-10 remained longer, circling once more before tipping its wings in a final gesture. Not quite a wave, but close enough. Her breath caught. For a fleeting second, she imagined the pilot inside, a human being she would never meet, saying without words, "You're safe now. Go live your life." She whispered a thank you under her breath, knowing it would never reach him, but meaning it all the same. On the bus that ferried them to the terminal, the passengers were a chorus of emotions. Some laughed nervously, others cried openly. A few spoke in hushed tones about writing letters of thanks to the Air Force, to the controllers, to anyone who had a hand in saving them. The businessman who had sat beside her slumped against the window, muttering, "I'm never complaining about airport security again." She sat silently, watching the horizon blur past, her thoughts a whirlwind. For hours she had lived in the shadow of uncertainty, convinced that the next moment might be her last. She had seen fighter jets outside her window, had stared into the reflective visor of a pilot who held her fate in his gloved hands. She had felt the weight of mortality pressing in as silence threatened to condemn them. And now she was alive. But survival didn't erase the memory. It etched it deeper. In the days that followed, she found herself replaying the events again and again. The shimmer of the F-16 in the sunlight, the wing waggle that had seemed like a warning, the strange comfort she had felt when the A-10 appeared, the crackle of the radio that had shattered the silence like a lifeline. She told the story to her family, her voice trembling as she described the helplessness, the fear, the strange clarity that had come with the possibility of death. Her loved ones clutched her hands, their eyes wide with horror and gratitude. But she knew they couldn't fully understand. How could anyone, unless they had been there, staring at a jet outside their window, wondering if it would be the last thing they ever saw? The world looked different to her now. Airports no longer seemed like mundane gateways, but fragile miracles of trust and vigilance. Every flight attendant's smile, every pilot's calm voice, every unseen controller guiding planes through invisible paths, all of it seemed extraordinary. And above it all, she thought often of the jets, the guardians who lived in the sky, ready to make impossible choices in impossible moments. She had seen them not as distant military machines, but as human beings caught in dilemmas too heavy for words. Sometimes, late at night, she imagined the F-16 pilot's view of her plane, the faces in the windows, the silence that could have meant anything. She wondered if he had prayed too, if his chest had tightened the way hers had, if he had whispered the same plea, "Let this not end in fire." And she thought of the A-10 pilot, steady and patient, circling until communication was restored. She imagined him going home to his family that night, kissing his children, never telling them how close he had come to carrying the weight of hundreds of lives on his conscience. The experience had changed her. She moved through life differently now. Small annoyances, traffic jams, long lines, misplaced keys, no longer carried the same weight. How could they, after she had stared into the possibility of annihilation and survived? She found herself savoring things she had once overlooked. The taste of coffee in the morning, the laughter of friends, the sound of rain tapping against her window. Life felt more fragile, yes, but also more precious. Months later, when she boarded another flight for the first time since that day, her hands trembled as she fastened her seatbelt. The hum of the engines brought back a flood of memories. She glanced out the window more than once, half expecting to see the shadow of a fighter jet beside her. But instead of fear, she felt something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that there were people out there, unseen and uncelebrated, who kept watch over the skies. Gratitude that she lived in a world where silence could be terrifying. But communication, even broken, crackling, fragile communication, could restore hope. As the plane lifted into the clouds, she closed her eyes and whispered again the words she had spoken on the day of the intercept. "Thank you." And though the pilots who had saved her would never hear it, she knew the sentiment would always live in her heart, a changed perspective, carved into her soul at 30,000 feet, where silence had nearly written her final chapter, and where voices, steady, human, and real, had given her a second chance.